build an economy that works for all. Reshaping our economy to create meaningful opportunities for all Americans requires fundamental shifts, and we are fortunate to be joined today by many of the leaders, the thinkers and the doers, who are at the forefront of leading those changes. In a short while, we will hear from two panels of experts in the financial sector to discuss the industry perspective on sustainable finance, the challenges, progress to date, and opportunities that lie ahead. Following their discussion, the Deputy Director of the National Economic Council will join us to lay out what we can expect to see from the Biden administration's recovery agenda as the nation emerges from the COVID pandemic. But first, to kick us off, we have the honor to be joined by one of the Senate's leading champions of remedying the fragility and concentration of opportunity in the US. Senator Warner has laid out an ambitious set of reform proposals centered around three pillars: rebuilding the social safety net, investing in American workers, and most recently, reshaping American capitalism. As this Congress debates structural reforms in these areas, Senator Warner is uniquely poised to effect profound changes that will hopefully realize a more equitable future for all. We are thrilled to have him with us today to offer his perspective on where things stand and what lies ahead. Before turning to the senator, let me just briefly address a few housekeeping notes. We are coming to you live today via Zoom and YouTube. Everyone's an expert by now. We will filter questions from you, the audience, during the panel discussions. Those on Zoom who wish to ask a question, please do so by using the Q&A button. Finally, we want to thank our many partners at the Aspen Institute. We have several policy programs at the Institute doing critical work in this area. I encourage you to check out the Economic Opportunity Program and the Business and Society Program, to name just a few. Finally, we want to thank API's founding partner, the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, for their support of this work. Senator Warner, over to you.
Whoops, got it. Dana, thank you, and for all the great folks at the Aspen Institute. I was very proud of the work that we did there many years under the Future of Work initiative. I want to also thank US CIF for their work and the good folks at Just Capital who I've had a chance to work with as well. You've asked me to do a lot, and since I only get 10 minutes and kind of as a senator, you can barely say hello in 10 minutes. Let me try to cut to the chase and again, welcome all of the participants. I think there is no more important issue than getting this right. How do we make capitalism work for a broader group of Americans than it has over the last 2 decades? I still think capitalism, when it works, has a history of bringing more people out of poverty than any other system. But I think we have to acknowledge that at least in modern America, it is not working for enough people. And the ideas that this webinar is going to lay out are terribly important. And I welcome the opportunity to partner with all of you, because too often in Washington, and I know you're going to have Barat and Mike Froman and others, lots of people with Washington experience, the sausage making, you focus on sometimes the short-term programs and not the overarching theory of the case. And I think this webinar is looking at that theory of the case. I think we all know, and what probably attracted us to this issue is inequality in this country is rising. Back in 1940, people who were born then had a 92% chance of advancing their social standing, doing better than their parents. By 1984, the chances of doing better than your parents, if you're born in this country, dropped to 50-50. And unfortunately, while I've not seen recent data, if you look at particularly what's happened in the last 10 plus years with the Great Recession and now COVID, my fear is that the percentage of people who may do better than their parents is sinking greatly. And when you see other nations, Canada, the UK, for example, having much greater ability for social advancement than America, we need to take that to the core and realize that our system is not working. COVID has driven home these points. It's driven home the points of racial disparity in this country, systemic racism. It's driven home the point that your educational attainment in many ways measures your ability to succeed in this new digital economy. And I view that what COVID has done, mostly negative, although there are some positive components, has really simply accelerated the move to a digital economy by a decade. And the positive comments, I don't want to misread what I said. Obviously, there's some horrible things happening with COVID, but the idea of the ability to use telehealth, the ability to recognize that high-speed internet connectivity, broadband, is an economic necessity, not a nice to have. Coming out of COVID are areas where we can find common ground. COVID has also laid bare the fact that many Americans were frankly a paycheck away from economic destruction. We all saw that before the crisis, the Federal Reserve showed that literally about 40% of Americans, and some numbers even show a little bit higher than that, were possibly could not absorb any kind of economic hurt that went beyond a unpaid $400 bill. Luckily, we took care of some of that during the COVID response. But I think we, again, need to step back and think about this systemically. Dana mentioned the fact that I've been working on some of these issues for the last 6 years and have written a document, 2/3 of which has been published. The last third will shortly be published, that lays out my thinking on how we deal with the enormous pressure towards short-termism in the markets, the enormous pressure towards outsourcing amongst workforce, the pressures against investing in human capital. And in my couple of minutes here, I'd like to very briefly address those three topics. First, I think we need to acknowledge in 2021, particularly coming back in a post-COVID work environment where people will be coming back in a variety of different forms, we are not going to be able to fit everybody back into the 20th century model where everybody works in a classic 40-hour work week, W-2 type of employment. We need to acknowledge that people are going to have, potentially by choice or by economic necessity, multiple gigs, maybe at the same time. But the idea that you're an Uber driver, an IT consultant, a waiter, and renting out your apartment, Airbnb, may become the rule rather than the exception. And the social contract that we put together back in the 20th century that gave you benefits, but only if you were a W-2 full-time employee, needs to be changed. We did make strides towards this in the first COVID relief bill, where we expanded unemployment to cover independent contractors and gig workers. We need to do all we can to make sure that coverage continues. Secondly, we need to, I think, aggressively pursue the idea that with any work, with the first hour of work ought to come benefits, and those benefits ought to be portable, and you ought to be able to aggregate all those benefits across different gigs and work types during your career. So a new social contract that meets the workforce where it's at, point number one. Point number two, I think we need to dramatically change how we think about investment in human capital. Too often our workforce training programs sponsored by government have had at best a mixed result, with very little data that shows what works and what doesn't work. But what we do know is that there is nothing in our tax code, accounting system, or public company reporting system that actually incents any company to invest in human capital. Matter of fact, we do the opposite. The example I like to cite is under our current tax accounting and reporting rules. If a company goes out and spends $5,000 investing in a robot, the company oftentimes will get an R&D tax credit. The robot is viewed as an asset and appears on your balance sheet. And if you're a public company, you can brag about it. The same company that went out and spent $5,000 training two, moderately skilled human beings to be more efficient than the robot would receive no tax credit. You could expense that, but you wouldn't get a tax credit. It would not be viewed as an asset on your balance sheet. And there's frankly no place to report it. We need to fundamentally rethink how we structure incentives around investment in human capital, because our failure to do so will not only continue the move completely towards technology, and I'm all for technology advancement, but we at least ought to be treating investment in human beings as good as we treat investment in stuff. And we need to recognize that will require a shift in tax, accounting, and reporting requirements. And again, we've seen some progress. The Securities and Exchange Commission, even under President Trump, started moving public companies towards some de minimis reporting around human capital. We need to blow that out. And my fear so far from President Biden is this area of radically rethinking how we invest in human capital is an area that I think we need bolder thinking. And again, I would welcome anybody from this webinar helping me think that through and how we can move that into legislative proposals. And then finally, and this is obviously an area where Allison at Just Capital and other groups on this line have been active already. How do we actually measure corporate performance that moves our society forward? I think we know from the Just Capital movement to the Be Capital movement to the inclusive capitalism efforts of Lynn Rothschild and others that investors, in many cases, definitely want their corporate entities they invest in to be more responsible. We know that workers want to work for companies, particularly younger workers, want to work for companies that have a level of social responsibility. The challenge is we have not figured out a way to measure that in an organized fashion. So I'm a big advocate of moving in the realm of ESG towards standards around environmental, societal, and governance that cut across all industries, that are clear, cogent, and that investors, employees, and customers can look at those companies you invest in, work for, or buy from, and see what they are actually doing in their work to move forward on those goals. I think we've shown that companies that hit ESG goals doesn't mean they're going to be less profitable, that the old notion that a short-term return is always going to trump long-term value creation is under serious scrutiny, but we need to put some structure around this. There's been a lot of conversation in this area, and I commend so many of the organizations who've been involved. But for policymakers like me, you need to give us more structure. I applaud efforts like SASB and others, but we're still a decade in, and yet we've not reached those common standards where we can hold particularly public companies accountable. I think the future is bright in all of these areas if we move aggressively. We have a moment in time now with the president who's willing to take bold action. We've got a number of folks in the Congress, and I will say on these issues, both portable benefits, rethinking investment in human capital, and ESG. This is not a Democrats only approach. A number of my Republican colleagues are very interested in these topics, and it might just be a place where we can come together and put some meaningful points on the board. I have now gone past to 11 minutes as opposed to my 10-minute timeline. I have lots of other comments that I'd love to make and love to engage with this group on. I hope I'm going to have staff on this webinar the whole time, and I hope that coming out of this we can move to more specific proposals that I and others could advance in the Congress. Again, my thanks to all of you for allowing me to offer these comments. And I think with that, Allison, I'll turn it over to you to introduce the first panel and get more into the nitty-gritty. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Senator Warner. It's always a pleasure hearing from you and your thinking on everything. So we look forward to engaging you further. Appreciate that. Panelists, can I ask you to turn your cameras on to join me? So excited to have such an esteemed group of colleagues to talk about the first panel, which building from what Senator Warner just shared, the idea for our conversation over the next half hour is really to understand where we are from a business and finance perspective, where the market is in terms of leadership and what it means for Washington. I want to share a little bit of context about Just Capital and some of the recent survey work that we've done to set the groundwork, and then we'll go into questions and answers. But first, let me just briefly introduce my panelists who I'm delighted to be sharing a virtual stage with. First, Heather Higginbottom, president of the JP Morgan Chase Policy Center at JP Morgan Chase. So thank you for joining us, Heather. Randy Strickland, director of Pathstone, and then Michael Froman, vice chairman and president of strategic growth at MasterCard. So thank you again for spending time with us this afternoon. So Just Capital has done some recent polling on Americans' views on market leadership, and we're a nonprofit. One of the things that we're really interested in understanding, and one of our core values, is talking to Americans and surveying Americans on what they think is important for companies in the market to prioritize. And one overall takeaway that I think is really important to ground this conversation is that we've seen a real increase in the expectations of the public on leadership on societal issues from companies specifically. We've been polling over the last couple of years on if CEOs in particular have a role to play in addressing social or societal issues. We heard last year 68% of people say that. We asked again in December, right after the election, and 79% of people said that it was more important than ever that companies speak up and stand up over the next 4 years. Obviously, that means a lot of different things to companies, or I'm sorry, to Americans, but it's really been interesting and important for us to be asking people, what does it mean for companies to prioritize their stakeholders? And it's really consistent across ideology that people start with treat your workers well, sort of fundamentally that good quality jobs, but also take care of your communities, your customers, climate and the environment, as well as your shareholders. Additionally, we've been doing a lot of polling in the last year around both the pandemic as well as the racial reckonings that we've been experiencing as a country. And what we are finding is we just finished 8 focus groups across the country, and we're releasing these results right now. What we're finding is that the increased expectation is even more sort of urgent than it has pre the last year. And that's very interesting because, and specifically people are looking for corporate leadership on wages, racial equity, caregiving, transparency, to Senator Warner's point about disclosure, and we can get a little bit more into that. But that's very interesting, at least from where I'm sitting, because simultaneously, the movement in the business and finance community has also, in the last couple of years, been towards being more solutions oriented, or at least one could argue that. Heather, Jamie, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon was the head of the Business Roundtable when BRT put out their new statement of purpose. MasterCard's been doing extraordinary things the last couple of years. Randy, we've seen real growth in the ESG market. I think in the last year, it doubled. The previous year, it grew by 10 times. So really significant interest from investors. And again, we'll get all into this, but just to set the stage that on one hand, we see increased expectations from Americans on how business and finance should be operating. On the other hand, we've been hearing from the business and financial community that these issues, inequality, climate, others, should be addressed and should be part of the solution, that the market should be part of the solution. And so this is an interesting moment. We find ourselves in an interesting time as President Biden sort of starts to put forth both his short and long-term, and the administration's short and long-term goals around inclusive growth, around racial equity, around climate change. So I'll stop there and start asking questions. But with that groundwork, I would love to just hear from all of you. How has COVID-19, racial injustice, the climate change, January 6th, and sort of the debate about democracy, how has that shaped the landscape from where you're sitting? And Heather, I'll start with you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Allison. Look, I think the issues you just cited and those that we're really focused on here and as a firm, climate change, the issues related to inequality, racial inequality in particular, these are challenges that government alone cannot tackle, right? We need to step up as the business community, nonprofit community, government in partnership and address these challenges, do what we can. So part of it could be through sustainable financing. It's part how we look at our products and services. It's how we use our data for public good. The core principle is we're going to be stronger as a country, as a business, as a society, if we are in partnership tackling some of these challenges. It's clear that not every business, not every firm is going to be in the same place on the same issues at the same time. But I think what we need to really be coming together to discuss and be in partnership around is how we can collectively move the needle. One of you cited some of the expectations of employees, of younger employees, of the general public. And I think that's because we haven't seen progress on these really big issues. And when you look at what happened with COVID and the disproportionate impacts of COVID on communities of color in this country, the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning that brought, we can't stand back and admire problems. And we need to figure out how we can take the resources that we have from the private sector in partnership with others to really try to advance that. I think that's the moment that we have. My concern is that we might miss that moment, that we might get out of COVID, take off the masks, go back to our offices, and leave behind what we really came to understand quite intimately over the last year, which is that we have, really a severe issue of historical inequity and a long period of inequality, and that we are collectively responsible, government, the business sector, the private sector, business, and nonprofits, to come together to try to move the needle and address some of those challenges. And we just haven't seen enough of that progress over the last decades.
Thanks, Heather. Randy, do you want to chime in?
Sure. I agree with everything that Heather just talked about. I think we are also concerned that this moment may pass us. The good news is that we're seeing in the financial advisor impact investment community more interest, more questions being asked from asset owners as to how they can marry their values with their investments. And many are also accepting the fact that things like climate change, things like racial equity, and other ESG issues do represent systemic risks. So that the fact that we've gotten past that, I think is tremendous progress. But then how to integrate ESG into a total portfolio still seems to be something that a lot of investors can't seem to grasp readily. And so there's a frustration that some of us have that the needle isn't moving quickly enough. But we're in a position now where we can educate folks. There's tons of studies, tons of information out there that investors are consuming. We just need to see movement of assets. And we still have to overcome some myths that this is not just a touchy-feely thing, that one can integrate ESG and also outperform. And so we still have a lot of work to be done from the asset owners, that being the pension funds, the large family offices, and the like, to show them how, in fact, to do this on a total portfolio, not just a carbon.
Thanks, Randy. Mike?
Well, I'm in agreement with both Heather and Randy. I guess I would say the following. I think the letters from Larry Fink and the BRT statement represented an important evolution in this whole dialogue. But whether or not one buys into the notion of stakeholder capitalism, it's in the long-term shareholder interest that we be taking the actions on ESG. I mean, as a company, we're focused on planting 100 million trees to deal with climate change, but also because it's important to our employees, to attracting and retaining our employees. It's important to the communities in which we serve. We're very focused on financial inclusion, having brought 500 million individuals who are unbanked into the financial system. Now we've doubled down. We're shooting to bring 1 billion individuals, 50 million micro merchants, 25 million women-owned merchants, because not only is that the right thing to do, but it's seeding the markets of the future. And it's creating long-term shareholder value. And I say that to build on Randy's point, which is ESG shouldn't just be viewed as a risk management tool. It should be viewed as a window into a number of new opportunities for businesses to integrate these concerns into their business strategy. And as Heather said, government can't do it alone. Philanthropy can't do it alone. We're only going to address these big issues if we mobilize the ingenuity and the resources of the private sector on a commercially sustainable basis. That's the only way we're going to be able to do things on a scaled basis. And so aligning shareholder interests with the ESG opportunities and risks management and the opportunities that creates to invest in these sorts of issues, I think, is really about how we're going to achieve progress in the long term.
It's so interesting that I think the way you all just described it, at Just Capital, we sort of think about what's required to change. One is really the narrative around leadership and expectation of what it means, Mike, to your point about what MasterCard has been doing, really redefining that of expectations, sort of moving past the last 50 years of just shareholders, but instead thinking about shareholder performance in a more holistic context and trusting and knowing that those connection points do exist. Randy, to your point, I think that, one is narrative and just expectations about leadership. The second is research in the business and investor case. And we have seen a lot of flows on assets in the last couple of years. Increasingly, there are connection points, but I think there is more work to be done just on research, on data. And then there's also, so narrative, research, and then really kind of what is the role of business versus government. And I think that that's part of what obviously this conversation is today. And I don't want to get into specific public policy solutions, but I'd really love to understand from where you're all sitting, what you think kind of, if we can get a little bit more concrete, what is the role of business versus government? We sort of say we all need to sit down to the table together and fully agree with that, obviously. But where do you feel like it makes sense to lean into business sort of ingenuity, as you said, Mike, versus saying that's primarily a role for government and we'll sort of let government lead? Happy to either hear from an issue perspective, like on climate change, really feel like we're following Paris, that's government, we'll sit down at the table. But curious if you can give us a little bit deeper of a sense of where that split exists between where you're leading as a company versus the business community overall versus looking to government to lead.
Happy to start it out. One of the issues that we run into dealing, particularly with institutional investors, is what the notion of their fiduciary responsibility is. And this is an area that, since policy really influences the investing community a lot, where the Department of Labor, and it's gone back and forth depending on the administration, as to how they define fiduciary responsibility. So if you're not considering ESG factors, or if there are mandates that you cannot consider climate change, racial equity, pay equity, water inclusivity, all of these ESG issues, if those sometimes non-financial factors can't be part of the decision-making process for pension fund and endowment trustees, then that's just halts the flow of capital into sustainable investments. So this is an area where business needs for government to lead. Business can certainly take the initiative, but what has happened in a lot of cases is those people who are either deniers or just not don't want to be out there, what they might consider taking in risks that are not prudent in terms of making investment decisions based on both financial and ESG factors. Those folks get the excuse that they won't consider ESG. Now, we think that ESG factors, we know that ESG factors have financial materiality, but in order to make that case, we need sound policy. So I think that's an area where we would love for government to adequately define what one's responsibility is as an asset owner of third-party assets like pension funds and the like.
Mike, you look eager to get in.
I agree with that, with what Randy just said. And there are certain roles that only government can play. And CEOs and companies are not elected officials. And we need to go through our democratic process for a lot of these for a lot of these issues. And to answer your question, Allison, I think where the government can create that enabling environment and the right regulatory guardrails, and then look to the private sector for innovation and for creativity to try and make sure that those things are done in as efficient and as effective a manner. I'll just to refer back to something Senator Warner talked about. He's done a lot of work on this whole issue of benefits and portable benefits and recognizing the changing nature of the economy, gig workers, people stitching together 2 or 3 part-time jobs, none of which are offering full traditional employer benefits. And yet, obviously, they have the same needs that need to be addressed. Looking, if government were to set certain parameters around that, and Senator Warner's has a bill that does just that, and then look to the private sector for the kind of innovation that would create the platforms, work with states and localities, work with gig economy companies to create the mechanisms through which an individual worker can really have the kind of social safety net they need for financial security. That would be a good division of labor. And so I think there's a legislative work to be done. As he said, there's some work to be done on SEC disclosures and reporting requirements, but there's a lot of work to be done in the private sector to ensure that we're bringing the best of the innovation of the private sector to the table. And the other area I would mention very briefly is there's been such huge advances in the private sector when it comes to data science and data analytics. And bringing that kind of capability to the public sector and the social and civic sector so that we're using data analytics developed in the private sector, but applied to the biggest social and economic challenges that we face in society. That is another area where there could be a division of labor that makes sense.
Now, I'll just add in, agreeing with both of those points. I think there's, first let me do on the data. I think something that the juxtaposition of what's the government's role, what's business's role. Yes, there should be some understanding of what is uniquely government, what is uniquely something we can do on the private side. Where do those things intersect? But I also think about the example of the JP Morgan Chase Institute that we've established. And this is using our aggregated anonymized data of the Chase customer base. So huge numbers of households that we can do real-time economic analysis on to get insights into, for example, over the past year, the different CARES Act COVID recovery programs to see if they're working as intended, to share that information publicly, but back with policymakers, which that data so often lags. And to Mike's point, not always the best infrastructure or analytical capability in the federal government, though I'd argue for much more investment in that federal infrastructure for data. But that type of partnership, again, it doesn't have to be so much a who does what as we are looking and trying to solve similar goals and objectives. And we have a unique lens, and let's really ensure that we're taking advantage of resources like that to solve common challenges. And then the second thing I'd say, and it's aligned with that, when we looked through our lines of business over the past year, particularly in the wake of George Floyd's murder, about the steps we could take as a firm to advance initiatives to address racial inequities. It was what was in our control, what we could do, what products, what targets, what goals. We made a $30 billion commitment over 5 years. We also are identifying some of those policy changes that we think would enable us to do more, or that are blocks to what we're trying to get done. And I think having that kind of lens, again, of a common shared goal, we have different roles to play, but they're going to intersect sometimes. And I think having the opportunity to raise where that happens and have good dialogue and openness around that, because we have a shared goal, is really important. And I say that as somebody who spent 20 plus years in government and have been in the private sector for only 2 of those years. But I think that sometimes we find ourselves in more pitted conversations than we need to have if we're trying to advance some common goals. And it's my hope that as we have this conversation around reforming capitalism, and as we have more discussion around these shared societal and economic priorities, that we can have more of those joint conversations that are productive in nature.
Thank you, Heather. Your comments made me think about something that Senator Warner said today, and I think we've probably all heard him talk about, which is the social compact or the social contract. And I'm curious if you all think that the social contract is changing. is there a different expectation or evolution about the relationship between business and government, and sort of what companies and finance is expected to sit at the table, or if it's just sort of a natural evolution to what has been happening? But I'm curious if you think that the pandemic, the racial reckonings, that there is sort of a new future, a new path to the reforming capitalism, or is it a natural evolution that won't sort of dramatically change things? Mike?
We're all watching each other's mute buttons to see who's moving first.
Don't leave me hanging. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Look, I think it is changing. And I think we saw over the context of the last year and a half, COVID, the collapse of small business, racial reckoning in the United States, that the private sector did step up and needed to step up. And my sense is that's a muscle that's going to continue to be exercised going forward. For us, we helped create the therapeutics accelerator to generate treatments and diagnostics more quickly for COVID with the Gates Foundation and Welcome. We've just announced a $25 million contribution to Gavi to help them in their efforts to vaccinate in developing countries. But even more than money, putting our technology, our products and services and people to work on these problems is something that certainly we've seen in our company, and we're seeing it across the board. So helping small businesses go from mom and pop brick and mortar businesses to online e-commerce enabled businesses so they can survive and now thrive. And I don't think that's going backwards. Dealing with racial reckoning issues, we focused on 7 cities around the country, working with mayors and local community groups to really identify ways in which we could bring investment resources, products, services, thought leadership, data, the same kind of data insights that Heather talked about that we produce from our Center for Inclusive Growth to the table to really help them deal with these kinds of issues. I think for all of us, we're finding it in our different ways. Every company will do something different, but I think we've all been through, it's trite to say, an unprecedented experience. And I think that has changed us all in our role going forward.
Thanks, Mike. Randy, I'm curious from your perspective as an investor, because I think there's a similar question about sort of a traditional, putting sustainable finance aside, sort of a traditional role of just moving capital in the quickest way, the most effective way possible versus a more of a societal role or sort of a bigger way to think about what being an investor is from a stakeholder perspective.
Yeah, we're seeing the change coming from the investors, the asset owners, who are demanding certain things of their the managers they work with, the other investment advisors that they work with. So they're asking questions about diversity. They're asking questions about ensuring that the managers that say they are impact-oriented, ESG-oriented, are actually living up to what they say they're doing. So they want measurement from not only a financial perspective, but from an impact perspective. So the things are changing. I'm seeing that, and asset owners are also sort of looking internally and seeing how their values can be reflected in their own investment portfolios. Families are getting pressure from that next generation who might be more purpose-driven than the matriarch or patriarch of a family. And certainly institutional investors, endowments, foundations, and pension funds are getting pressure from not only politicians, but from their own constituents, whether that's students, faculty at a university. A foundation is trying to many have come to realize that there is a disconnect with their investment portfolio and the mission of that organization. And in pension funds, the same thing, where the pensioners or those that are part of that plan are paying into that plan. We're saying we want our investments to reflect diversity, inclusion, climate change, to address all of those things. And people are also recognizing the intersectionality of all of these issues. You don't get to racial equity unless you address climate change, because climate change disproportionately affects communities of color, underserved communities. You don't get to racial equity unless you address clean water, pay equity, hiring practices. All of these things, all of these ESG factors are part of the decision-making process that investors want their managers to accept and employ. So yeah, we're seeing a change again. It's still, for those of us who've been in the space a while, I don't want to sound like I'm complaining. I'm happy that things are moving in the direction they are, but we needed to move quicker. And we also don't need billions of dollars. We need trillions of dollars to flow into sustainable investments.
Thanks, Randy. I know we have 4 minutes left. I'm going to try and ask 2 questions simultaneously. We'll see if I'm successful. From an ESG perspective, especially in the public policy realm the last couple of weeks, even, we've been hearing a lot about climate change in particular. Just Capital is largely, or one of our main focuses is human capital or worker issues. And Senator Warner was sharing some of the work he's been doing to identify human capital priorities. One of the questions that just came in from the audience was actually about the role of business on climate and other issues, but sort of the role of business as their own business, your own company, versus the societal role. And so I want to ask you, primarily from a worker perspective, but I'm happy to have you address it from a climate perspective too. What is the role of business and finance in addressing inequality writ large, as well as within your own companies? How are you creating good jobs and rebuilding the trust after a year of intense challenges? And then similarly thinking about, climate or other sort of collective action challenges, both from your own companies as well as more broadly. So I think I'm asking partly a philosophical question, but like really concretely, what do you see as your impact within your own workforces and your own practices versus societally overall? Mike, you're up first again.
Well, look, I'd say you've got to start and get your own house in order in the first place before you have any credibility for doing something outside. And whether that's with your employees, it's not just about paying a living wage, it's about ensuring their financial security. Making sure, for example, when we took a bunch of the 2017 tax cut and raised the match for 401k so that people have put 6% in, got 10% match, so they could actually save and have a decent retirement over a period of time. And that's just the first step towards doing anything on the outside when it comes to financial security. And similarly on the environment, we're all committed to net zero, I'm sure, but it's all about not just your own activity, but how you're working with your supply chain to get them to get to net zero. And then how do you use what assets you have? We're not a big emitter, but we are a network. And so our ability to bring together our network of partners to mobilize resources to plant 100 million trees over the next 5 years, or to be able to use your banking app to track your carbon footprint as you spend money, and then immediately be able to offset it by planting trees. That's what we can do to contribute. First, get our own act in order with net zero, but then also using our capabilities to have a broader impact on society.
I just agree completely that entering into some of these spaces, whether they be climate or some of the issues around racial equity, you have to speak from a place of authenticity, and your employees and your stakeholders need to understand that you are taking care of your own house and supporting your employees, that you're committed to diversity and inclusion, that you have is at the highest level priority for your firm. And I think that not every firm is in the same place on those journeys. And I think it's important that we continue talking about those issues and making sure that if you're talking about inequality and you're talking about what it means to support people, you're talking about training, you're aligning that with what you're doing philanthropically to bring more people skills and into the workforce. And there's a real thread there that is about every tool you have in your toolbox to address and advance those priorities.
Thanks, Heather. Randy, final words?
Oh, I'm going to close this out now. I can't really disagree with anything that was said. I do want to say that when we think about diversity and inclusion, sometimes we default just to numbers. And so the companies should have, and I'm including my own here, hiring practices, benefits that benefit everyone, lower earning employees as well as the higher earning ones, pay equity, when they're looking at maybe mentoring and how they can upskill perhaps lower paid employees that may be at risk. There was a question about AI earlier in the chat, but companies that could be displaced by technological advances, how can they get not only better paying, but higher skilled jobs? So diversity and inclusion is not just we have this many of this type of person and so many women, so many people of color. It's how one treats and hires and promotes all employees.
Thank you. Thank you, Randy. And thank you, Mike and Heather, for such a great conversation. And I'm sure, like the next panel, we could have gone on much longer, but I really appreciate you taking the time today. Lisa, really delighted to hand it over to you, the CEO of US SIF, to hear our next conversations about more specific public policy solutions. So Lisa, over to you.
Thanks so much, Allison. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lisa Wall. I'm the CEO of US SIF, the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investment. We're an organization of members, asset managers, asset owners, community investing institutions, data providers, nonprofits, advisors, and consultants that work to advance the field of sustainable and impact investing. And of course, to follow Allison and her team, we're two sides of the same coin in a way, because so many of our members are using their investor power to ask companies, sometimes try to force companies to be better actors around all of these issues. And so I'm looking forward to our panel today, which is Joe Keefe of Impacts Asset Management, John Hale from Morningstar, Holly Ensign-Barstow from B Corp, and Zav Briggs from Brookings. So welcome, panelists. And just to follow up on the prior discussion, do you agree that the public increasingly expects private sector action on environmental social issues? And if so, how could this impact the policy work of the Biden-Harris administration? And you each have a minute and a half to answer that. Thank you. John, why don't we start with you? Go to Joe, go to Holly, go to Zav.
All right, great. Thank you, Lisa. Well, great discussion on this beforehand. I think we'll probably reiterate a lot of those points, but I think, yes, more and more companies are expected to take action on climate and other environmental and social issues. The sort of anti-corporate responsibility paradigm of the past half century, I think is giving way to this new expectation that corporations should do more to address broader issues that they have impact on, rather than always waiting on government action, not to mention opposing government action against more narrow issues that might affect them. I think, you can see this obviously in among consumers more often making buying decisions partly based on their perception of how responsible a company is or how impactful it is, or maybe in protest of a company's sort of negative externalities. It can be seen among workers who care more today, it seems, about what kind of company they work for. Maybe it's especially among higher skilled workers who have more choices in an employment context, who really have the ability to consider a company's purpose and broader impact when they make their employment decisions. And, among employed workers already, working for change from within a company, I think is something that's actually happening. And that, you hear about sustainability issues in terms of how often they're drivers of employee engagement. Well, why is that? Well, because employees want to be part of something that makes a positive difference in the world. And they're starting to do that, I think, more and more in corporate settings. And then finally, last but not least, is among investors. You can see this in increasing numbers. Investors are just no longer focused only on this sort of single-minded pursuit of profits, but rather on really trying to consider people, planet, and profits as they assess their investments in a more holistic way. So I would say two quick things in terms of the implications for policymaking. One's already been touched on. Senator Warner mentioned it, and that's transparency. It gives stakeholders the information that they need, including investors, but all stakeholders, the information they need through corporate disclosures to make better and more informed decisions in areas like climate risk and the racial and ethnic and gender makeup and pay of employees, and things like political spending. Very important. The other thing is, I think, we need to have a better way of bringing corporations to the table directly with other stakeholders to take on big problems. And I think this should be done, directly and not through the traditional sort of incumbent industry trade organizations, which to me seem sort of hopelessly stuck in the past. But it's one thing for major corporations to more or less individually come out and oppose, say, voter suppression laws. What about sitting down at the table in an organized fashion, the administration convening to form a corporate democracy council or a corporate council on racial justice to really focus action on these kinds of issues?
Thanks, John. Joe.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, nor with the last panel. Senator Warner started out the discussion by saying that there are now public expectations of corporate responsibility, but it really, I think, goes beyond that. I think there are now public expectations that increasingly that companies be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, and that's just not a cliche. Being part of the problem or just being corporate or corporate responsibility is sort of a do no harm standard. Take care of your externalities and so forth, to a different standard where if you're part of the solution, you're being asked to sort of play a vital role in society and to shaping society. And I think companies are increasingly being asked to do that. There's plenty of data and research now that makes the business case that demonstrates that will be in the best interest of your shareholders. But a more expansive notion of the modern corporation is taking shape, again, where a company's duty is not just to its shareholders, a la Milton Friedman, but to a much wider group of stakeholders, which include employees and customers and the communities where it does business and the natural environment, and ultimately the public interest. And those are the expectations that are setting in. And we're seeing this on climate. We're seeing this on issues of human capital and diversity and equality and inclusion, which have been, laid bare even more so by COVID, the pandemic, and the Black Lives Matter movement and so forth. But something else would have set them, in action. So it's taking place. And John mentioned, and I don't think there could be any clearer view of this, or example of this, I should say, Lisa, than when all these companies suddenly took a stand against voter suppression laws. That's something you would never have expected of a company before. That's where, companies are starting to address climate, which is an existential crisis for the planet. Companies are starting to address things they perceive to be existential crises for democratic capitalism. And so in fact, that was so unusual that, Mitch McConnell fired a shot across their bow, and some characterized it as threatening. Unusual step for companies, but I think that's where this thing is going. They're going to be at the table, and increasingly, because government has been so AWOL for the past four years or so, and some would argue for decades, companies know really, and I think investors know, and the public knows, companies have to do more.
Thank you, Joe. And I want to come back to the voter suppression piece towards the end, because some of that happened because the public outcry was so great. And so that's an important nexus to discuss. Holly, if you want to answer the question, and then Zav, just jump in as soon as Holly's done. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lisa. And based on my experience over the last 9 years working to drive acceptance of stakeholder governance in the public and the private markets, my answer to this question is 100% yes. For us, 2020 has really been a tipping point for the B Corp movement. The number of companies wanting to become a certified B Corporation was up 40% in 2020 compared to 2019. We saw, 4 different benefit corporation IPOs, a bunch of SPACs, 3 different public company conversions with another planned for fall 2021. And, to be honest, these companies wouldn't be willing to make this change if they weren't seeing what John and Joe have already emphasized, right? That, consumers and employees want to buy from and work for companies that do more than just make a profit. They want companies to have a purpose and to be part of the solution to global challenges instead of, basically roadblocks to progress. And I think this is obviously incredible news for the Biden-Harris administration. There is an appetite for change like I have never seen before, a willingness to collaborate amongst nonprofits like B-Lab. And I truly, truly believe that there is a large percentage of the private sector that is now willing to kind of sit down and listen and partner to advance new ideas. So I am very hopeful.
Okay, Holly is optimistic. Zab, how about you?
Lisa, great to be with you in this group. I'll pick up right there. I would highlight 3 things quickly. One, I think we've seen expectation from the public of moral leadership. This gets to the public's deep, deep appetite to see institutions show accountability, living their values. That takes many forms, and we've heard a number of them already in the session today. But on the democracy issue alone, I know we'll come back to it. I don't think we've seen anything close to this since the Second World War and the McCarthy era. Nothing directly comparable, I mean. Number 2, I think the past year has shown us many, I would call them Rosie the Riveter moments. I'm going to focus on workers for a moment. And many reminders of how workers, especially workers on the bottom of this economy, disproportionately women and people of color, but millions and immigrants, but millions of others as well, pulled up the whole economy. They're critical to making all of it work, and they have been far too vulnerable and far too ill-protected and poorly rewarded. So you see the public saying, we want something done about that. And this in a year where many corporations registered record profits, right? Depending on the sector they were in, et cetera, et cetera. So the juxtaposition of that was very jarring for the public, and they made that abundantly clear. But number 3, what about the Bessemer vote? What about the vote in that Amazon warehouse? I think we see, and we have to just reconcile this and work through it. Many American workers have no direct experience with a union as an organization to represent them. And yet they yearn for, this is very clear in the data, the things that unions have traditionally provided in the way of voice and representation. So we need to figure out where to go with that. And that too could take a number of forms. So this goes beyond just transparency on pay and things like that. Also worker voice in the leadership of companies and industries.
Thank you. Okay, Joe, according to the USF Trends Report, climate change has been the #1 specific ESG issue for asset managers. How does this focus on climate intersect with the administration's central focus on addressing the climate crisis?
Well, very much so. I think the private sector and the public sector are coming together. We never could have hoped that so much would be accomplished in the first 100 days, or at least started. But I think the signs are there. All the signals are there, Lisa. The SEC issued sort of guidance 10 or 11 years ago on reporting on climate risks and disclosure. And I think that's about to become mandatory in some way, shape, or form. The SEC started by appointing a climate advisor, senior climate advisor, then a task force. They've now asked investors to weigh in on what they should do when it comes to climate disclosure, specifically in ESG disclosure more generally. I think the handwriting is on the wall, and we can expect to see something in the not too distant future that will hopefully enable companies to do more. I think it's possible. My company impacts asset management. Julie Gordy and I, some of you know Julie, filed a petition for rulemaking with the SEC, asking them to require companies to report on the physical locations so investors can look at that in determining whether companies have physical risk associated with climate and so forth. So I think we're going to see some rulemaking that will enable companies to do more. Sunshine is the great disinfectant, right? As Justice Brandeis said. So I think they'll start with disclosure, but I think it will be in some respects mandatory, as it should be, because regulation SK, you're supposed to report on your risks, and I think companies are going to be asked to start doing so.
Well, and I would add as well as the SEC, of course, the Treasury Department has just hired a counselor to Janet Yellen on climate. And of course, there's a whole of government approach. And I think we'll also see investors putting more money right? More investments into clean climate and clean energy initiatives than it's happened even up till now. Okay, so John, you closely follow the trajectory of and focus of ESG-oriented funds in the US. Can you talk for a minute about how events of the last year, building on what the last panel said, have increased the focus on social issues, including diversity and inclusion, and if you have a moment to add about shareholder resolutions and how those have focused on that as well, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think for end investors, asset managers, and individuals, climate change has sort of been the issue that has perhaps maybe brought them to the table to want to become ESG investors in the first place, and even corporate kind of environmental impacts generally. But the pandemic has just made so clear how important it is to understand how corporations treat their workers, as well as their customers and the communities they operate in. So I think it's definitely easier for end investors today to make that S connection when they think about ESG. And then George Floyd's murder and the subsequent events really underscored the need to dismantle systemic racism in this country, and the very use of the term systemic suggests that corporate America really needs to play a role in that. So now we have ESG investors paying attention in ways that I think will help influence corporate America to make a difference on this all important issue. And so we're starting to see that in this year in proxy season, as ESG investors are engaging with corporate America on DEI issues. Shareholders at dozens of companies this year are asking firms to disclose publicly the EEO-1 data that they have to file with the government, showing the racial, ethnic, and gender makeup of its workers, so that as companies make commitments to improving diversity, investors and other stakeholders will be able to better measure their progress. And so we've seen strong support for these proposals so far, including at DuPont, where like 83% of shares were voted in favor, something almost unheard of in proxy voting. And then beyond that, there's shareholder proposals this year at some companies asking for third-party racial equity audits, right, of the firm's DEI programs, practices, impact of products and services on communities of color, and other activities like political spending. More than a third of shareholders at several meetings so far this year, Citi, Johnson & Johnson supported such proposals. JP Morgan Chase shareholders are voting on that at the company meeting tomorrow, I believe it is, Amazon.com in next week. So we're seeing a lot of that. BlackRock, which has embraced ESG investing in its asset management business, agreed to a shareholder request to perform a racial equity audit without the need for a vote. And so that's successful engagement in pushing companies in that direction. And just to add, it appears so far that growing support for these resolutions is coming from big mutual fund companies that hold significant stakes in most large corporations. They used to, vote almost routinely against management or with management, and never in support of shareholder resolutions related to ESG issues. That's been changing a lot in recent years, and maybe changing significantly this year. We won't know for sure until August, because that's when mutual funds are to file their votes with the SEC.
Thank you. All right, Holly, B-Lab has been doing work on reimagining fiduciary duty. Why is it important to do that to get to a more sustainable private sector?
Well, I mean, it should come as no surprise that B-Lab believes that the rules that govern the decision-making of corporate directors, otherwise known as fiduciary duty, are preventing companies from creating value for all stakeholders, and are often also driving decisions that hurt our social and environmental systems, and sometimes even our economic system as a whole. And to solve issues like climate change or inequality, directors must instead be required to consider the impact of their decisions on their stakeholders as well as their shareholders. And we've been asking companies to do this work of reimagining their fiduciary duty for a long time. And we've been super successful in both creating that pathway to a reimagined fiduciary duty through stakeholder governance, and in driving its adoption. We've passed benefit corporation laws now in 44 states, 7 countries, and which are now being used by 10,000 companies around the world. But with all of that success, we've also realized that these leaders are actually operating in a system with misaligned incentives, where their ultimate owners, their investors, are governed by a decision-making rubric that basically forces them to focus on financial value maximization at individual companies and not on system-wide ESG issues. And you know, Randall, during the last panel, really focused on this and really highlighted this issue. And for companies, this means that making like a true commitment to stakeholders is actually incredibly hard. And that commitment is often under attack or feels like it's about to be under attack. And so what we believe we need to do to solve this problem is essentially change the fiduciary duty of investors as well as companies so that they are both operating using stakeholder governance. We think that, you know, investors can act as responsible owners and companies can help create an economy that works for all people on the planet under that system.
Thank you, Holly. So Zav, this is a great segue to you, and you've been part of an initiative at improving the lives of American workers. And there's some policy recommendations there. Can you talk for a minute about some of the key policy changes the group is looking for in order to do that?
Sure, Lisa. First, just to say this is a politically diverse group of people, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, socially diverse, also professionally diverse, CEOs, institutional asset owners, business and economy researchers, education leaders, worker advocates, others. And we began with the premise, by the way, months ahead of the pandemic and ahead of the election year, began with the premise that we wanted to outline a new compact between business, government, and the American worker. Number one, because it takes all those partners to make the economy work, each has to be doing their part. This was never just about business in relationship to government or workers in relationship to employers. It was about the triangle or the three legs of the stool, if you will. Number two, we worked hard. I'll name a few policies as you asked in just a moment, but just to stress why a compact. It's got to be relatable, explainable. It's got to sit on, yes, economic and business foundations, but also strong moral foundations. It's got to be consistent with our highest values about the way the economy and our society should work. So the specific policies sort of run the gamut, include many of the things that Senator Warner touched on in his opener today, from a different approach to workforce investments to robust but also flexible labor standards, like raising the federal minimum wage, ending the subminimum tipped wage, which is racist and sexist in the way it operates and in its origins, and it has to go. But also changing things like these perverse tax incentives that bizarrely treat stuff, as Senator Warner put it, as an asset, but workers as a liability. We need to change that. And we also include a set of ideas for modernizing worker representation, essentially on the idea that the specifics might look quite different in different sectors or different scales of company, and that's okay. But what's not okay is running the economy in a way that doesn't fundamentally reflect the voices of workers, in addition to protecting them and paying them fairly.
Thank you very much. Holly, just to come back to you a minute, USF, for example, in our policy recommendations has supported the idea of a White House office on sustainable finance and business. B-Lab is part of a similar but slightly different initiative. There are other organizations that have pushed the same idea, sort of how do we get both a policy-making kind of focus, but also a kind of how do you bring this up to kind of a level of national discussion? So why do you think this is important that we have some kind of focal point at a high level in the administration to put a focus on the private sector? What are the two things you think is really useful about that?
Thank you. Look, you know, we all know that the Biden-Harris administration has the three core challenges: economic fallout of COVID, you know, widening racial wealth gap, and climate change. But what we also all know, but maybe don't say all the time, is that these issues can't really be solved in silos. You know, all three must be addressed in a coordinated manner. And as you mentioned, you know, B-Lab, in partnership with the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance and more than 50 other organizations, has proposed that in order to meet this moment, really, and to promote that kind of coordination across silos, that the White House should create an initiative focused on inclusive economic growth housed at the National Economic Council. And I think what we're all witnessing is a real need for kind of a mechanism or a forum within the White House that will engage corporations and investors alongside government to achieve these shared goals together. And we really believe it could help move the discussion beyond kind of just incremental progress and focus more on kind of smarter, better regulatory and policy change. And honestly, we would believe that without this coordination, some of those issue-specific solutions for things like climate change or racial equity, basically the administration's top priorities will honestly be, by definition, less effective without that coordination.
Thank you. And Bharat will be joining us at the end, so maybe he can note how possible such an initiative might be. So one of the things that came up in the last session was the idea of what's happening at the DOL. And of course, one of the places where sustainable finance and business really come together is through retirement systems, which is where most Americans have savings, if they have it at all, or investments. Many people don't have money to do discretionary sort of mutual funds or ETFs. So we know that most retirement plans in the US don't have any kind of sustainable investing option, let alone more than one. And John, can you talk very briefly about what the DOL is doing to change that?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first thing that is happening is that the Biden DOL is refusing to enforce the rules that the Trump DOL sort of hastily passed last year before leaving office. So those would have made it more difficult to put sustainable funds into an ERISA regulated retirement plan and would have made it easier. Also, another rule for asset managers to avoid voting on shareholder resolutions of the sort I was just talking about earlier. Where it goes from here, we'll likely see a new rulemaking. I think it can largely, be guided by the hundreds of comments the DOL already received on this subject last year, which we did a study on it, and they were overwhelmingly in favor of making it easier, not harder, for retirement plans to include sustainable fund options. My expectation is that the DOL will make a determination that ESG considerations are material to investment outcomes and therefore well within the notion of fiduciary responsibility of a retirement plan administrator, not something that falls outside of it. It's part of long-term investing. And so flowing from that should be a fairly clear-cut okay for sustainable funds to be included in a plan menu as long as they meet the same selection standards that would apply to any fund or strategy. Yeah. And then finally, and this is big, the Trump rule banned the use of ESG in target funds, which take up most flows because so many plans use them as default options. On the theory that some plan participants may not agree with ESG or something to that effect. So I expect we'll see clear-cut guidance that target date funds can include ESG or consist of ESG funds, again, so long as they meet appropriate selection criteria that would be required for any fund to meet.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, coming from this conversation about voting and restrictions on voting and how companies began to speak out, I did note that they often began to speak out after there was such a public outcry about not speaking out while the legislation was being created. And so one of the questions I have, I think one of the ways we get a more sustainable private sector is for the private sector to do more work on meaningful policy that would move that forward. So really quickly, because I know we're running out of time and I want to make sure Bharat Ramamurthy has enough time to speak, how can we get more investors and companies to be champions of meaningful policy change? And I'm going to go Zav, Holly, Joe, John. Thank you.
Lisa, I'll call out two things. One is to join in these bigger tent efforts, which have emerged and really intensified over the last several years in particular. I think we see in this conversation the sort of the manifestation of acting collectively. It's good for all kinds of reasons. Number two, I have to say, healthy pressure is a good thing. So I also want to see investors, both institutional and retail, and customers continue to send signals to companies about what they expect. I think that's going to continue to be absolutely vital.
Thank you. Holly.
I mean, within the B Corp community, there's a massive amount of interest in engaging on social and environmental policy issues. What I'd say is not there though, and is something that we really need to create is the pathway that enables that engagement. And I think there are a few gaps that we need to fix to really get there. I think there's a lack of understanding of the problem, of the various problems that they need to engage on. And I think that there is also, there's not a clear solution that they should be advocating for. It's hard to understand what the right horse is to back. Second, I think that companies in general haven't done a lot of, this sort of advocacy work. And so they need a lot of education and, clear, easy first steps that kind of introduce them to this concept. Then I think also that the companies and investors really underestimate their power. In my experience, people on the Hill, the administration, state legislatures, they want to hear from employers. So I think if we can underline how, sorry.
Okay, I'm going to move to Joe and John just so we have enough time before 4 o'clock. So Joe and John.
Well, just briefly, if you talk about public policy, look, the elephant in the room is that so many people have lost faith in government as a vehicle that can really tackle social problems and that can work. And that isn't sort of divided by bipartisan gridlock and so forth. So I really think it's important in this moment, in the early days of the Biden administration, by going big, that we have some success, and be able to demonstrate how some changes in public policy can move the market and benefit the market and benefit workers and benefit consumers, whether it's new disclosure on climate change or disclosure about disparities between male and female employees or white and non-white employees' pay or things like that. By closing these through disclosure and whatnot, we could demonstrate some change, because the public broadly, beyond us sort of in our sort of, more insider community, does not believe that government works. So if companies are going to continue to feel pressure from the public, the public's got to believe that something works. And that's my big worry right now, is that, we're at a place in time where there's sort of this epistemological divide in the country, and then there's a loss of faith in our democratic institutions. And we got to turn that around. We don't have all the time in the world to do that. We have the next 4 years and maybe the next 2 if things change dramatically. So I think we need to have a real sense of urgency.
And the only thing I would add to those great observations is that I think companies, traditionally work on policy through industry trade organizations that focus on narrow industry issues. And if that's big picture issues, it's very anti-regulatory, sort of trickle down economics in the last 40 years. So these groups are not fit for purpose here unless they're significantly reformed. And so I think something needs to happen there. Perhaps new entities are needed, some new mechanisms that can really help organize the sort of purposeful, sustainability-minded corporations and investors fight for change.
Well, I want to, before I segue to the next section, I want to really thank all of you for being part of this panel today, for being great at answering so many questions in such a very compressed period of time. I know who to do speed dating conference style with going forward. So thank you so much. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Bharat Ramamurthy, who is the Deputy Director of the National Economic Council and is primarily working, at least the last time I talked with him, on financial reform and consumer protection. Bharat, it's a pleasure to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Lisa, and good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak here today, especially following Senator Warner and all these great panelists. I had a chance to listen into the remarks and the panels over the last hour or so. They've been fascinating and actually have prompted me to change a bit of what I was going to say. Before I started working in this administration, and as Lisa mentioned, currently serve as the Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. But before this administration, I spent time first in the Senate for several years and then at a think tank working on these issues surrounding inclusive capitalism. And whenever I would mention to somebody that I was working on these issues, they would ask me questions about it that clearly indicated that they had wildly different definitions of what that meant. So some would ask, does that mean corporate social responsibility, like charitable donations, for example? Others would ask whether that meant government policies on taxes and spending that would expand the safety net or address income and wealth inequality and produce economic outcomes that were more fair. So before diving in today, I thought it'd be useful to define what I think of when I think of inclusive capitalism or sustainable capitalism or stakeholder capitalism or whatever your preferred term might be. So fundamentally, I think it's about the legal obligations that corporate decision makers have and the financial incentives that they respond to. In other words, it's about how corporations make business decisions. So what do we see in the data about how corporations make these business decisions? What I think we see is that starting about 40 years ago, there was a serious divergence between worker productivity and wages. So post-World War II, there was a steady increase in worker productivity and average wages for workers rose basically in lockstep with that. Now, of course, entire categories of workers were excluded from those benefits because of their race or because of their gender, but broadly speaking, for those who were given a fair shake to participate, they benefited as their employers benefited. Then you see around the late 1970s a shift. Worker productivity keeps climbing, but average worker wages basically stagnate when adjusted for inflation. So to put that simply, what you see is workers have kept contributing to corporate growth and profits, but haven't gotten a fair cut of what they have helped produce. Now, look, that shift coincided with a shift in how corporations make business decisions. Around that time, in the late 70s, early 1980s, this idea that corporations only had one obligation, which is to maximize value for shareholders, started to take hold. And it contributed, you can see in the data, to a massive shift in what corporations did with their earnings. So corporations went from dedicating about half their earnings to shareholder payouts in the form of dividends and share buybacks to dedicating about 90% of their earnings to shareholder payouts. And over the series of years and decades, that represents a shift of literally trillions of dollars in how they flow through the economy. While that was certainly not the only cause of stagnating wages and other harmful outcomes for workers like offshoring, it's hard to dismiss the idea that that shift in philosophy played at least some role. And look, unfortunately, we've seen that during the pandemic too. While many corporations have tried to do right by their workers, many unfortunately have not. And it's hard to shake this feeling that in good times, shareholders and executives benefit first and workers benefit last. And then in bad times, workers pay the price first and shareholders and executives pay the price last. All you have to do is look at the data on corporate profits during the pandemic, the success of the stock market, the incredible increase in CEO pay during the pandemic, and compare that to how the typical worker has faced furloughs or layoffs or grueling frontline work in the middle of a public health emergency. The president has talked about the need for real reform in this area. Here's what he said on the campaign trail last year. He said, "It is, quote, way past time for America to put an end to the era of shareholder capitalism, the idea that the only responsibility a corporation has is to its shareholders." He also said that American corporations, quote, "have responsibility to their workers, to their community, and to their country." And that was part of a broader message, his Build Back Better message. Fundamentally, getting through the pandemic, getting shots in people's arms, providing emergency economic relief was a critically important step, but still was only step one. The next step was to address some of the long-standing problems with our economy that existed before the pandemic, and to take bold action to try and address them once and for all. We can already see some of this emphasis on inclusive capitalism in the president's policies to date. So for example, one of his first actions was to issue a Buy American executive order, which begins the process of tightening the requirements for federal procurement so that we buy more goods made by workers here in the United States. He has made a number of strides on climate issues, such as the emphasis from the White House on advancing a just transition for workers in the energy sector. And of course, he has been more emphatic than any president in recent memory on building worker power, whether that means a $15 minimum wage, whether that means making it easier to join a union and building up union density, or giving unions more power to fight for the workers that they represent. But there's a lot more to do here. And as we look forward, I think that there are a few key areas that we might look into as we explore these ideas around inclusive capitalism. First, the legal obligations of corporate boards and investment fiduciaries. Do the current legal obligations create the right incentives and produce good outcomes for workers and communities? Are they promoting innovation? Are they setting up American corporations to compete effectively on a global stage? When it comes to investment fiduciaries, what does it mean to faithfully represent the interests of investors? Does that mean maximizing returns only, even if it means, for example, supporting actions that can hurt the communities that investors live in? Those are all types of questions that I think are worth exploring in detail. The second category is representation on corporate boards and other key decision-making entities. So as many of you know, other countries have different approaches when it comes to this issue. Some have works councils, some actually require worker representatives on corporate boards, up to half of the board in places like Germany. And we can see how that can have concrete impacts on corporate decisions during a crisis. So for example, in countries with worker representatives on boards, we can see that sometimes they push for current employees to take a pay cut rather than for there to be layoffs during a crisis, so that you maintain that connection between workers and their firms. Again, in this category, are there reforms that would help address some of the longstanding problems that I've talked about? And how would they help or improve the quality of corporate decision-making? And the third category is financial incentives, including both executive compensation and worker compensation that can have a significant role in shaping corporate decision-making. With the rise of shareholder value maximization in the 1980s, we saw more and more executives compensated in company shares. The idea being that it made sense to more closely link the executive's personal financial interests with the shareholders' financial interests. That has led, as you might expect, to decisions and actions that are focused on driving up the stock price. It has also led to a massive increase in the last few decades in the average CEO to worker pay ratio. In the 1980s, it used to be well under 50 to 1. Now it's well over 300 to 1 on average. On the worker side, are there concrete ways to cut workers into a larger share of the corporate profits that they help produce? Some have suggested, for example, broader executive stock compensation programs to give workers more voice in corporate decision-making and a firmer link to corporate profits. To my mind, all of these ideas are worth exploring, and we intend to do so. I think we're at a unique moment here in which people from across the political spectrum, people across from business representing workers, have all come around to the idea that we need to make some changes here. That there are some fundamental distortions in the current rules that are producing outcomes that fall short of what we would hope for. We hear that from the business community. We hear it from Republicans and Democrats alike. We certainly hear it from unions, from workers, from academic experts. And even if we disagree on the exact contours of the diagnosis, the exact solutions that we would propose, I think there's a recognition that there's a time for action right now. So to that end, this administration is going to look for ways to make progress on this issue. We're going to start by looking into some of the questions that I discussed. We want to hear from a wide variety of folks from the business community, representing workers, representing academic experts, people who have looked at this issue in other countries. And our goal is to come together to build consensus, to try and make some changes in order to build back better, as the president has talked about. So what I would ask is that the folks that are here today would keep in touch. The panelists that we've heard from would reach out to the White House, to me personally, with ideas for suggestions to help move these concepts forward. And my hope is that we can look back at this moment, at this administration, and say, not only did we recover strongly from the pandemic, but we were able to seize this moment to push American capitalism into a better place so that it produces better outcomes for workers and makes American business more competitive for decades to come. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Brett Buttle. I have the pleasure of being a senior fellow at the Aspen Institute. Thank you, Bharat, so much for making time to join us today for closing comments and just being here to, quite frankly, listen and take these inputs from our amazing set of panelists. And there's been some great dialogue in the chat as well. I want to just add my thanks to everyone who joined us today, from Bharat to Senator Warner to all of our panelists. Today, as we heard, this is just the beginning of a conversation. We're at such a critical moment in our country and in society. We have such an opportunity over the next few years to really shape the public policy debate that will really level the playing field for everyone. So with that, I want to let folks know that today's event is being recorded and it's being streamed online. We hope that this is just the beginning of a conversation. I encourage you to check out our many partners' websites. Please visit us at aspeninstitute.org to learn more about the Partnership for an Inclusive Economy. With that, thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us, and this will now conclude this webinar. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.